6 months. That's how long you survive after losing your job. No missed rent, no maxed out credit cards, no desperate loans from family, no financial collapse. Just 6 quiet months of breathing room. And it begins here, at a red light, with a cardboard box sitting in the passenger seat. The strange part is that nothing around you looks different. The traffic is moving. The coffee shop on the corner is still open. People are walking dogs. Someone is laughing on the sidewalk. The world has absolutely no interest in the fact that your income disappeared 30 minutes ago. But your brain does. Your brain is already sprinting 6 months into the future. What about next month's rent? What about groceries? What about insurance? What about the car payment? What about everything? And that's exactly where the real danger begins. Most people think losing the job is the disaster. It isn't. The disaster usually starts 72 hours later. Not because you run out of money, because you start negotiating with fear. Fear has a voice. It sounds surprisingly reasonable. Maybe you deserve a little comfort after today. Maybe one purchase won't matter. Maybe you'll find another job quickly. Maybe things aren't that bad. Fear never sounds reckless. That's what makes it expensive. The first 72 hours after a layoff are dangerous because you haven't accepted reality yet. You're trapped between two worlds. The old reality is gone. The new reality hasn't arrived. And in that gap, people make decisions they spend months regretting. Some panic and spend. Some panic and invest. Some panic and start businesses. Some panic and pretend nothing happened. Different actions. Same emotion. The emotion is urgency. And urgency has destroyed more financial plans than unemployment ever did. The uncomfortable truth is that surviving a layoff rarely depends on how much money you make afterward. It depends on what you do before tomorrow morning. Because right now, your biggest problem isn't income, it's uncertainty. And uncertainty behaves like a fog. The thicker it gets, the worse your decisions become, which is why the first step isn't finding a new job. The first step is something far less exciting. You need to know exactly how many days your current life can survive. Not weeks, not months, days. Because the moment you know that number, the fog starts to lift, and the countdown begins. Hour 1, you stop guessing. Hour 12, the emotions are still there, but now they have competition. Numbers. You sit at the kitchen table and open every account you own. Checking, savings, emergency funds, cash, everything. No estimates, no optimism, no rounding up, reality only. Then you write down a single number, the total amount available to keep your life running. Next comes the harder part. You list every expense: rent, utilities, insurance, food, transportation, minimum debt payments, nothing else. No fantasy budget. No ideal future version of yourself. Just survival. Then you divide. And suddenly something strange happens. The layoff transforms. Yesterday it felt like a catastrophe. Today it looks like arithmetic. Painful arithmetic. But arithmetic nonetheless. Maybe the number says 182 days. Maybe it's 90. Maybe it's 220. The number doesn't matter. What matters is that uncertainty finally has boundaries. And boundaries are powerful. Because fear loves infinity. Fear tells you everything is falling apart. Numbers tell you exactly how far things can fall. That's very different. Most people never reach this point. Instead, they stay trapped in emotional math. Emotional math is dangerous because it changes every day. On Monday, you're convinced you'll find work immediately. On Tuesday, you're convinced you're doomed. On Wednesday, you're optimistic again. Nothing changed, only your emotions did. Real math doesn't care about your mood. That's why it's useful. By the 24th hour, something else begins to change. You stop thinking in dollars. You start thinking in days. Money becomes time. That restaurant dinner, 3 days. That streaming subscription, 1 day. That impulse purchase you've been considering, half a day. That weekend getaway, 10 days. Suddenly, every transaction has a visible cost. Not in dollars, in survival. And once you see money that way, it's impossible to unsee it. Because time feels more valuable than money. You can waste $10 without thinking. You won't waste 3 days so easily. This is the first quiet advantage. Not motivation, not discipline, perspective. You begin measuring decisions differently than everyone around you. And that's exactly when the influencer appears. Of course he does. He always does. Somewhere around the 36th hour, your social media feed starts changing. The algorithm notices. You search for one video about layoffs, then another, and suddenly he's everywhere, standing in front of rented cars, walking through luxury apartments, smiling with absolute certainty. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. Stop looking for another job. Start a business immediately. This is your opportunity. The timing is perfect, because uncertainty makes certainty attractive. And nobody sounds more certain than someone selling a dream. For a moment, the message feels good. Maybe he's right. Maybe this is your chance. Maybe losing the job was secretly a blessing. But then you look down at the notebook sitting on your table. 182 days. That's what the notebook says. The influencer talks about opportunity. The notebook talks about survival. The influencer talks about freedom. The notebook talks about reality. And reality wins. Not because it's exciting, because it's true. 48th hour arrives, then 60th, then 72 hours. The panic slowly starts losing its grip. Not because the situation improved. You still don't have a job. You still don't know what happens next. But now you know something incredibly important. You know exactly where you stand. And most people underestimate how powerful that is. Because the goal of the first 72 hours was never to solve the problem. The goal was to stop making it worse. Most financial disasters don't happen in a single moment. They happen one emotional decision at a time. One purchase. One gamble. One attempt to escape reality. The people who survive longest aren't always the smartest. They aren't always the richest. They're often the people who do something surprisingly boring. They accept reality faster than everyone else, and acceptance is where survival begins. The first 72 hours are over. Now the real test begins. The fourth day feels different. Not better, just quieter. The shock has started to fade. The numbers are written down. The runway is calculated. The panic has lost some of its power. And that's usually when a different danger arrives. Overconfidence. Because now your brain starts telling a new story. You've survived the first 72 hours. You've made a plan. You've cut expenses. You're thinking clearly. Maybe things aren't so bad. Maybe you can loosen up a little. Maybe one small exception won't matter. That's how financial drift begins. Not with a dramatic mistake, with a tiny one. The problem is that emergencies don't end when the initial shock disappears. They become management problems. And management problems are boring. That's why most people stop paying attention. The influencer understands this. Not consciously, but instinctively. He knows boring doesn't get views, so his message changes. Last week he told you getting fired was an opportunity. Now he's telling you speed is everything. Your first $1,000 online is only one idea away. Successful people move fast. Average people hesitate. His videos make urgency sound like intelligence. But urgency and intelligence are not the same thing. In fact, during a financial crisis, they're often opposites. Because speed feels productive, even when you're running in the wrong direction. You notice something strange. The influencer never talks about expenses. He never talks about runway. He never talks about risk. He talks about upside. Always upside. Because upside is exciting, downside is boring, yet downside determines survival. A pilot spends more time thinking about what could go wrong than what could go right. A surgeon does the same. An engineer does the same. But somehow, when money is involved, people are encouraged to ignore risk entirely. That's backwards, especially now. Because you're no longer playing offense. Not yet. You're playing defense. And defense isn't glamorous. Nobody posts screenshots of expenses they didn't make. Nobody celebrates subscriptions they canceled. Nobody brags about preserving cash. Yet that's exactly what separates people who survive from people who spiral. The strange thing about financial stability is that it often looks like nothing is happening. No breakthrough, no transformation, no overnight success. Just another day, then another, then another. The influencer would call that boring. The person paying next month's rent would call it progress. Weeks pass. Applications go out. Some receive responses. Most don't. Interviews appear, then disappear. Recruiters promise updates, then vanish. The uncertainty remains. But now you have structure. You wake up with a plan. You know what needs to happen. You know what can wait. You know what matters. And structure is powerful because it protects you from emotions. Every crisis eventually becomes a test of consistency. Can you keep making good decisions after the fear fades? Can you stay disciplined when nobody is watching? Can you keep protecting your future when there is no immediate reward? The influencer's world is built on visibility. Everything must be seen. Everything must be announced. Everything must become content. Your world is becoming the opposite. Invisible, private, quiet. Not a brand, not a movement, not a reinvention story. Just a quiet collection of decisions that keep extending your options. One more week, then another, then another. The funny thing is that nobody notices, and that's exactly why it works. A month passes, then another. The financial pressure becomes familiar, not comfortable, just familiar, like carrying a heavy backpack long enough that your shoulders stop complaining. You still feel the weight. You simply stop talking about it. That's when the isolation begins. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind nobody sees. One evening you're sitting at dinner with family. The conversation moves naturally from topic to topic. Work, travel, plans, the future. Someone eventually looks at you and asks a simple question. How's work going? The table becomes strangely quiet. Not because anyone knows, because nobody knows. Only you. For a split second, you consider telling the whole truth. The stress, the uncertainty, the calculations, the constant awareness of every dollar leaving your account. But you don't. Instead, you smile. You say you're exploring a few opportunities. Technically true, completely incomplete. The conversation moves on. Nobody notices. Yet something inside you does. Because you've crossed an invisible line. You are now carrying information that changes your life while remaining invisible to everyone around you. And that's a lonely place to stand. People assume financial hardship is painful because of the money. Sometimes. But often it's painful because of the performance. You keep showing up. You keep smiling. You keep participating. Meanwhile, an entire private reality exists beneath the surface. Then comes the moment that stays with you. A close friend calls. He's excited. You can hear it immediately. He tells you about a trip he's planning. A long weekend. Nothing extravagant. Just enough to get away for a few days. Then he asks if you want to come. The invitation is genuine. The friendship is genuine. The problem is the timing. As he's talking, your mind automatically performs a calculation. Not dollars. Days. You've been thinking in days for months now. The hotel becomes 4 days. The flights become 6. The meals become 3. The transportation becomes 2. 15 days. The trip costs 15 days of survival. Your friend doesn't know that. To him, it's a vacation. To you, it's half a month of security. You pause, then decline. Politely, casually, without explanation. He accepts the answer immediately. Why wouldn't he? From his perspective, nothing important happened. From yours, everything did. Because what you actually said was this: I choose future stability over present comfort. But that's not what he heard. He heard, maybe next time. And that's the strange thing about invisible discipline. Nobody sees the decision. They only see the outcome. Months later, they'll call you responsible, resilient, level-headed. They'll admire the result. They'll never see the sacrifices that created it. The dinners skipped, the purchases postponed, the invitations declined, the quiet moments when nobody was around and you had to choose between relief today and security tomorrow. The hardest part of surviving a layoff isn't hiding success. There isn't any success yet. The hardest part is hiding vulnerability. Not because you're ashamed, because you don't want your uncertainty becoming someone else's burden too. So you carry it quietly, day after day, week after week. And eventually something unexpected happens. The struggle starts changing you, not into someone stronger, into someone more aware. You begin noticing how many financial decisions people make emotionally, how often they confuse spending with progress, how often they mistake movement for direction. You start seeing what the first 72 hours taught you. The goal was never money, the goal was clarity, and clarity changes the way you see everything. The months keep moving, and eventually the countdown reaches 0. Then one day it happens. Not dramatically, not during a life-changing moment, not while standing on a mountain, not while delivering some triumphant speech. You're probably doing something ordinary, making coffee, checking emails, cleaning the kitchen, trying to stay busy. Then the message arrives. An interview result, a phone call, an offer, a beginning. For a few seconds you stare at it, not because you don't understand what you're reading, because you do. You understand exactly what it means. The countdown is over. The runway did its job. The plan worked. The months of uncertainty finally have an ending, and yet something strange happens. You don't feel the explosion of emotion movies promise. No dramatic celebration, no overwhelming rush, no cinematic victory. Just relief, quiet relief, the kind that settles into your chest and stays there. Because the truth is, the victory happened long before this moment. The job offer is simply the visible result. The real victory happened during the first 72 hours. It happened when you chose reality over panic, when you opened the accounts, when you wrote down the numbers, when you stopped guessing, when you accepted the situation faster than your emotions wanted to. Everything that followed was built on that foundation. The interviews mattered, the applications mattered, the job offer matters, but none of them mattered more than the decision to face reality honestly. Most people imagine survival as a dramatic event. It isn't. Survival is usually invisible. It's built from small decisions that nobody notices. One expense avoided, one emotional purchase resisted, one unnecessary risk rejected, one more week preserved, then another, until eventually the future arrives, and you realize you made it. The strange part is how ordinary everything still looks. The grocery store hasn't changed, the gas station hasn't changed, the streets haven't changed, the city hasn't changed, the world kept moving while you were fighting a private battle, and now it keeps moving, as if nothing happened. Because most important battles happen internally. Nobody sees them. Nobody applauds them. Nobody even knows they occurred. A few weeks later, you're driving again. Another red light. Another ordinary afternoon. The same road you traveled 6 months ago. The same steering wheel beneath your hands. The same traffic. The same buildings. The same coffee shop on the corner. Everything looks identical. For a moment, you remember the cardboard box, the panic, the uncertainty, the fear that arrived before you even reached home. Back then, you thought the layoff was the event that would define the next chapter of your life. You were wrong. The layoff wasn't the defining event. Your response was, because losing a job is something that happened to you. What happened afterward was something you chose. You chose to measure reality. You chose to manage resources. You chose to protect time. Most importantly, you chose not to let fear make decisions on your behalf. And that's what carried you through. Not motivation, not optimism, not luck. A series of invisible choices. The kind nobody notices while they're happening. The kind that never go viral. The kind that never become inspirational social media posts. The kind that quietly change outcomes. That's why the influencer never understood the real story. He thought the layoff was about reinvention. He thought it was about opportunity. He thought it was about building something new. Maybe one day it will be. But first, it was about survival. And survival is rarely exciting. It's practical, it's repetitive, it's disciplined, it's boring, which is precisely why so few people master it. People love breakthroughs. They love transformations. They love dramatic turning points. But most financial futures aren't built from breakthroughs. They're built from maintenance, from protecting what already exists, from extending options, from preserving flexibility until opportunity arrives. The irony is that those behaviors rarely look successful in the moment. In the moment, they look cautious, conservative, unremarkable. The payoff comes later, much later, when the storm passes, when the pressure fades, when the outcome finally becomes visible. That's when people assume you handled everything well. They see the result. They don't see the architecture underneath it. The hundreds of tiny decisions holding everything together. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside the first 72 hours. Not just after a layoff, after any setback, any uncertainty, any unexpected disruption. The people who survive aren't always the smartest. They aren't always the most talented. They aren't always the most motivated. They're often the people willing to do something very few others will do. They're willing to look directly at reality before reality forces them to. Because reality ignored becomes panic. Reality measured becomes strategy, and strategy buys time. Sometimes that's all you need. More time. 1 extra week. 1 extra month. 1 extra opportunity for life to change direction. The red light turns green. The traffic begins moving again. You take your foot off the brake. The road ahead looks exactly like it did 6 months ago. Yet everything is different. Not because your circumstances changed. Because your understanding did. You know now that financial survival isn't built by one heroic decision. It's built by hundreds of invisible ones. And if the decisions that shape your future are usually the ones nobody sees, if the most important victories happen quietly, if the strongest financial position often looks completely ordinary from the outside, then maybe the real question isn't how much money you make. Maybe the real question is this. When uncertainty arrives, will you spend your energy trying to look secure, or will you quietly become secure?